Welcome, everyone. This is episode 97 of the Space Policy Show. I'm Colleen Stover from the Aerospace Corporation. The democratization of space, the idea that to develop, launch, and operate in space is opening up to more new space nations, as well as the commercial opportunities, the main driver being cost. When cost goes down, the opportunities go up. So in the US, Civil has been integrating space services for a while, defense space to a lesser extent, but they are looking to kind of move on this outsourcing of certain services. In fact, we talked about it on a recent episode of the Space Policy Show when we hosted directors of the commercial offices, both from Space Force and from NASA, in episode 94, Assessing Commercial for Government Space. So check that out if you want to hear directly from those offices. Today's show features an interesting thesis presentation regarding this kind of intermingling of commercial and military and what it might mean for the future of armed conflict. We're hosting Professor David Koplow from Georgetown University Law Center. He specializes in public international law and national security law. And he'll be talking to Sam Wilson, Senior Policy Analyst at the Center for Space Policy and Strategy. And Sam leads our work on commercial and national security space, comparative space, and missile issues. So it promises to be a very interesting discussion. I hope that our viewers walk away with some questions of their own, and they're sure to read Professor Koplow's paper in full. And I know Sam has some good questions lined up to kind of pick a little bit at the theory of the paper. So Sam, go ahead, take it away.
It's a real pleasure to be here today with Professor David Koplow. David, in addition to being an expert in his field, is also just a great guy. So I think we'll have a fun time today. Thanks for joining us today, Professor Koplow.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
And we are discussing David's recent piece in the Harvard National Security Journal. The title, Reverse Distinction, a U.S. Violation of the Law of Armed Conflict. An extremely interesting and important piece that I would suggest is even more, perhaps even more provocative than its title suggests. So David, to start, why don't we begin with your presenting your argument?
Well, good, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to present this argument, this thesis. What I'll do is shape the argument itself, and then we can engage in a discussion back and forth. You're just right. The central claim here is that the US national security space policy, not just in the Biden administration, but going back several presidencies, is fundamentally both illegal and foolish, and is directly contrary to some of the most important tenets of the international law of armed conflict. So that's my claim, and in order to substantiate it, let me begin with just the briefest of a backgrounder on the law of armed conflict, also known as the law of war or international humanitarian law, and set the stage for this argument. The starting point for the law of armed conflict is the principle of discrimination or distinction. The requirement that during an armed conflict, a belligerent is allowed to direct its attacks only against the enemy's military objectives, not against civilians. Now, that simple sentence covers an awful lot of ground, and there's an awful lot of ambiguities and loose ends on that, but that's the starting point. The requirement that there be a differentiation between opposing combatants and civilians or neutrals or non-combatants.
And military objectives, can you explain what that is? Is that not just weapons, but more broader than weapons?
Good, yes, it's personnel, it's locations, it's anything defined in the applicable treaty as anything that by its nature, location, purpose, or use makes an effective contribution to the warfighting and whose destruction, capture, seizure, or neutralization at the time would provide a military advantage to the attacker. So it's a broad category, but the important thing is that what's not in that category is the civilians. and their objects and their and neutrals and others who are not engaged in the fight. And the starting point for the law of armed conflict is a division, a differentiation between those two categories. And that rule is accepted by everybody around the world. It's fundamental law. It might be the first rule of the law of armed conflict. An important corollary to that, sometimes referred to as the principle of passive precautions, but I don't much like that term, so I invented the term reverse distinction as the title for my article. This corollary says that in support of the differentiation between military and civilians, the military is required to separate itself from the civilians, so that in part is designed to spare the civilians some of the worst ravages of conflict, and in part it's designed to enable the opposing military to fulfill their primary obligation, that is to differentiate between military and civilians. If the two are too closely intertwined, then you can't separate. So this requirement is that the military either move itself away from the civilians and their objects, or move the civilians and their objects away from military, so that there can be a differentiation, a distinction. And this corollary is well known, it's well accepted, it's written in the Fundamental Treaty, and it's regarded as customary international law. So it's binding even on countries like the United States that have not joined that particular treaty. And so it's hard law, but an important restriction or limitation on this rule is that it applies only to the extent that it is feasible to achieve this separation. And that term feasible is one of those marvelous military words that defies easy definition. It's understood to mean the limitations that are practical or that are reasonable or that can be achieved in all the circumstances obtaining at the time. And therefore, there's a certain amount of ambiguity about distinction. One way of understanding.
I was going to ask, are there, on this concept of feasibility, because I think this is crucial to kind of understanding where you end up falling on this issue. Are there examples where it's clearly infeasible to try to differentiate between the civilian assets and the military assets?
Sure, and in fact, the one I like to cite is the entire US interstate highway system, which was originally authorized and funded as the defense highway system because it was justified as providing expeditious transportation for soldiers between military bases and airports and seaports. But obviously, the highway system is used by both military and civilian. And equally obvious, it would not be feasible to require the construction of separate roadways, one for the military and a separate construction of roads and bridges and tunnels exclusively for civilians. That would not be feasible. And similarly, it would not be feasible to separate the national electricity grid or the local systems for providing water and sewage services. Those are so dual use that it would not be possible to differentiate them. But in other circumstances, it's clear that a separation would be feasible. For example, it would clearly not be appropriate to put a military headquarters on the top floor of a hospital, or to put your anti-aircraft installations on the playground of a school. There, it would be feasible to separate, to move the military installations, the military personnel and equipment away from the civilians, so that the war fighting could take place in a way that protected civilians to the extent possible. So that's the nature of the feasibility dilemma. One example that some people may recall was during the first Gulf War in 1991. Saddam Hussein deliberately parked two of his top-of-the-line MiG-21 fighters on the apron of a famous archaeological site, the 4,000-year-old Temple of Ur-Nammu, and did that for the obvious purpose of protecting them, deterring coalition bombers from striking those valuable military assets because of the fear of damage to the archaeological site, or perhaps baiting the coalition into attacking those sites and then exploiting for propaganda value the damage that would have been inflicted upon the temple. And in that instance, Saddam's violation of the principle of reverse distinction succeeded. The coalition forces decided not to attack those military assets, and they were protected by his illegal action. And there are plenty of others, other examples of violations, illegal violations of the principle of reverse distinction. The taking of human shields, for example, is a deliberate attempt to protect a fighter by compelling a civilian to stand right next to the fighter, and illegally violating the concept of separating the military from the civilians. So that's the standard law of armed conflict that's binding on the United States and all other countries. And the United States has vigorously and rightly condemned the taking of human shields, the placement of the fighters next to civilian objects. The United States has been a leader in complaining, rightly, when others violate that rule. Now we come to space. And the dramatic difference is that in space, it is now the United States that is the leading practitioner of the black art of violation of the principle of reverse distinction, because the United States has a national policy of deliberately mingling military and civilian space assets. For the last several presidencies, not just Biden or Trump, but going back to Obama and George W. Bush and Bill Clinton before them, the policy of the United States has been to rely as much as possible upon the private sector for the performance, for the support of military space activities, including those undertaken by the intelligence community and by the armed forces. And the leading examples of this would include communication services, where the military relies upon private and third country space assets for communications between headquarters and fielded forces, or between the forces themselves. Photo reconnaissance or other remote sensing of the Earth, where the United States purchases imagery and other products from commercial services that overfly the battle space, and the United States uses those civilian assets to obtain military advantage. And a third example would be launch services, where the United States relies upon private companies to launch national security satellites, and relies upon a mixed use bus, the satellite transporter, that houses components that some of which are military, some of which may be civilian at the same time, and juxtaposes inside the satellite bus both military and commercial or private assets. So there it is, the United States seizing for military advantage the opportunity to use private or commercial satellites. Exactly the same kind of a violation of reverse distinction that the United States has criticized Saddam and others for doing. So that's the argument in a nutshell, that the United States is now in violation of the law of armed conflict by impermissibly mingling rather than separating military, intelligence community, and private or commercial assets in space.
I wanted to ask if you'd also mention the international entanglement piece of this that you write about in your paper. You talked about the entanglement of or the commingling of commercial satellites with national security assets. But what about the commingling of U.S. national security assets with another countries, of foreign countries' assets? Like, for example, the placement of a U.S. national security payload on a Japanese navigation satellite.
No, you're absolutely right. And that's another dimension of this violation of the requirement for separation. I've been talking so far about the separation between the military and civilians. A similar sort of analysis applies to the military and neutrals and the satellites associated with other countries that are trying to remain neutral in an armed conflict that the United States participates in. The requirements for neutrality are that the country abstain from fighting and that it not support any side in that fighting. When the United States uses, in your example, a Japanese satellite for communications purposes or remote sensing purposes or any other purpose, that's using the satellite for the military advantage during a time of armed conflict, and it is inconsistent with the obligations that Japan would have as a neutral. And that would then jeopardize Japan's enjoyment of the benefits that neutrality is supposed to provide. In space, it's even more complicated because of the special rule in the Outer Space Treaty that requires that a country is responsible for the actions of its nationals in space. So if a privately owned Japanese satellite engages in non-neutral behavior by supporting the United States military campaign, that's not a problem just for the owners of that satellite. It's attributable to the government of Japan as well. And so it's a violation of the government's responsibilities to remain neutral if it seeks to preserve that status.
Got it. Yeah, that's I thought an important piece of the paper. Could you also talk about really briefly how if at all, the law of armed conflict addresses dual use, the farmer by day, fighter by night concept that you introduced?
Good, and you're just right. That's one of the key complexities. And anytime you have to start, as I did, by giving a one-sentence definition of discrimination or distinction, you inevitably get bogged down in the question of dual use. But in some ways, the law of armed conflict does try to simplify that by saying there's only two categories. There's military activity, military objectives, and civilians and their objects. There's no third category for dual use. And the definition of civilian is everything that's not a military objective. So the starting point is that the country that's undertaking an attack has to first determine the nature of the objective, the object that it's aiming at. And if it is something that provides a military benefit to the other side, whose nature, location, purpose, and use is providing a military benefit, then it's a military objective. If it's not that, then it's a civilian. And the problem with dual use systems is that they may partially benefit the military objectives of the other side, and they may partially be civilian in character. And you have to determine, in the circumstances prevailing at the time of the attack, is this object supporting the opposing military? And if so, then it's a military objective and it is subject to attack. For items that alternate back and forth, or for people like the farmer by day and the fighter by night, it's hard to resolve exactly what the nature of that person or entity is at any particular time.
Yeah. I think that's a super important part of the legal framework here. So before I disagree on anything, I should establish, mention my credentials or lack thereof. I want to emphasize I'm not an attorney. I'm not a law school professor. However, David, my wife is an attorney, and she and I dated when she was in law school. So I feel as if I have a visceral understanding of the suffering that comes with becoming a lawyer, if not any of the knowledge that it produces.
Vicarious law degree is an important thing.
Yeah. I should also note that that I have in the past written. There's a piece that I wrote with Jamie Moran a year and a half ago, arguing that DoD and the intelligence community should go further in leveraging commercial space developments. So I wanted to note that before I offer any critique. But to me, this provision seems a little ahistorical, right? I can't think of a war in which commercial assets were not used. Now, I'm thinking of American wars, Revolutionary War, merchant ships were used. In Civil War, privately owned railroads were a strategic, were an important strategic asset. In World Wars I and II, you have ocean liners serving as troop transports. And famously in World War II, you have Dunkirk, where you have even small private fishing vessels that are contributing to the evacuation. So is it that, if you apply this provision, any war would be violating it? Or is it that you see something unique to space, something fundamentally different in space?
So my argument is absolutely that space is not unique in this respect, that the law of armed conflict, the same principles should apply regardless of domain, and that the limitations, the restrictions on land, sea, and air should be extended to space as well. And my critique is that the United States government is behaving differently in space compared to what it's done in land, sea, or air. You're just right that in every war, commercial activities, commercial operators get involved in the fighting. And when they do that, they sacrifice, at least to some extent, for a certain period of time, their civilian protections. They become military objectives, and they're subject to attack. And that's part of the deal. If you want to participate in the fighting, if you want to support one side in the fighting, if you want to commercially benefit by contracting with the United States government to provide rail services or freight services or whatever it might be, then you're participating in the fighting and you are subject to attack. If you don't want to run that risk, then you can retain your civilian protections. You just can't participate in the fighting. And every activity has to make that choice, and the government has to make that choice. In all the other domains, the government has decided almost entirely to rely upon entirely military or intelligence community assets. The Navy, for example, buys its own ships and aircraft, and the Navy does not say, we could save some money here if we didn't build so many ships and we just planned whenever there's a war to commandeer or contract with private ship owners to use their vessels. That's not what we do in the Navy. The US Army builds its own or buys its own trucks and tanks and everything else, and does not say, let's just build a small number of trucks, and then if we need more in a war, we'll just go to Avis or Hertz and rent some more trucks. They don't do that. The government builds its own trucks. And the reason for doing that is precisely to protect the civilians from the ravages of war by differentiating between military objectives that are part of the war fighting and are subject to attack by the adversary from civilians who are protected. It's only in space where the government has a deliberate policy of doing precisely the opposite and of making planned use, continuous use of civilian assets for the performance of military functions, when instead the government could just buy more satellites of its own, build more satellites, use government assets for military purposes the same way the government does in other domains.
Yeah, I guess so. Your differentiation between what's happening in space and what happened in prior wars in other domains is just the degree to which we're talking about it in terms of space. Is that
right? And that's what feasibility means. So one argument could be that it is not feasible for the US government to build a completely self-sufficient fleet of satellites to perform all the communications, remote sensing, and other functions, and that would not be feasible. And that would be a coherent argument. I just think it's factually wrong. Sometimes there is a cost benefit to using a private satellite. Sometimes there's a benefit that the private sector has proven to be very adept at uptake of new technology, quicker than the government can. There'd be an advantage there. But in fact, the government could do it. It would cost more, but the fact that it would cost more does not mean it's not feasible to do so. And the real telling argument here is that every once in a while, when you look at what the government says about the decision to rely upon commercial satellites for communications, remote sensing, and other services, sometimes they say, oh, it's just a matter of cost. But sometimes they say that one of the other benefits is that it complicates the task of any adversary who might undertake anti-satellite warfare against us. That if the adversary, Russia or China or anybody else, had merely the task of shooting down a small number of US government owned and operated satellites that do the remote sensing of the communications, that might be a tempting target. But if the adversary instead had to deal with a very large number of commercial satellites that are also providing remote sensing and communications and other services, that'd be too big a task, and the adversary would be deterred from taking on the task of challenging the private sector, and for that matter, satellites of other countries that may not have been involved in the fighting, but whose satellites were providing those same kinds of services. And that would provide a deterrence advantage. And I acknowledge that's a strategic reason, but it's exactly an illegal reason. That's exactly what the law of armed conflict is designed to prevent. The law of armed conflict is designed to spare the civilians the risk of combat, designed to force the burdens of war to be borne by the military, not by the civilians. And that's what we do in all the other domains. It's only in space that our military strategy is to imperil the commercial and private sector more and to spare some of the risk from the military. That might work as a tactical operation. It's just illegal under the law of armed conflict.
Yeah. As I said, a very interesting argument. I want to return to this feasibility point because I think this is the most important one. But first, I did want to mention the two analogies, which to me are emotionally powerful, right? You talk about Saddam Hussein parking these fighters at a cultural heritage site, but to me, like the analogy is still a little, it feels a little distinct from what you're talking about with respect to space, because first of all, for this one, there's not even a feasibility exception, right? For cultural heritage sites, it's more of a categoric prohibition. And then the human shield bit, you talked about Milosevic and other examples of armies using human shields to protect certain assets. There's a problem in agency there, right? And again, legally, maybe this doesn't matter, but human shields, presumably they are unaware or they are being coerced, whereas a commercial communication satellite company who signs an agreement with the Department of Defense to sell them to allow them to use their services, there's an agency there, right? Like they are agreeing to do this, and whichever and accompanying any risk that brings. But the human shields element seems different to me. I mean, is there legally just no difference, or is it just materially it feels different?
Good. So let's take both those points. First, the parking of the jets near the cultural heritage site. And you're just right, cultural heritage gets a special protection. But Saddam Hussein did more than just that. He parked military assets next to dwellings and deliberately violated the separation between homes and aircraft as well. And that is, I think, quite analogous to what happens in a hosted payload situation, where there's a satellite that has components, either sensors or transponders, and some of those are serving military purposes or intelligence community purposes, and some of those are serving commercial purposes. And the two sensors or the two transponders are right next to each other, and they are serving different markets, different customers simultaneously and intermittently. And that's exactly the same, I think, as putting a military asset right next to a civilian asset.
The agency point is also, I think, distinct here, right? Like presumably the people whose houses those are not, willingly are being coerced to having a military asset parked in there by them, right? Whereas again, that's different than what we're talking about with space, where they are agreeing, like this is a contract. They're accepting that risk for money, right? I mean, to me, it seems much more, analogous to something like CRAF, like the Civil Reserve Air Fleet, which was, which was activated, in April, in the evacuation, in the evacuation of Afghanistan. That seems much more analogous. These airlines are agreeing to do this than someone parking this juicy target in a civilian in an urban center.
So with human shields or other circumstances like that, there are a variety of different kinds of relationships that exist. The worst would be an involuntary human shield, where the fighter grabs a civilian and forces that person to walk along in front of me or alongside me while I'm carrying out my military campaign. Mm-hmm. The civilian does not have a choice, is being compelled to do that. Another category is a voluntary human shield. This is a common tactic in Milosevic's era, where they encouraged civilians to come stand on the bridges that might otherwise have been military targets. And the civilians, some of them wearing t-shirts that had bullseye targets on them, sort of taunting the NATO aircraft to bomb the bridge and destroy the military objective at the price of killing lots of civilians. And that too proved a deterrent. The NATO forces largely refrained from attacking those assets that were protected by voluntary human shields. And the third category would be human shields that don't even realize they're being used in that way, that there's a military asset in their neighborhood that's being concealed, although the adversary knows that it's there. And the people don't even know that they're running this risk when they go to the market or go to their workplace or their homes. And you're right, the fact that in some of those scenarios, the humans are making a choice to expose themselves to that risk, that makes a difference ethically, but legally not so much. The requirement under the law of armed conflict is to separate combatants from civilians. And if the civilian says to the military, hey, I've got a truck here, let me start hauling some of this equipment for you, the military is supposed to say, no, we got this, we're doing this on our own. And the purpose of the law of armed conflict is to shield civilians, even civilians who are not particularly interested in being shielded themselves. Now, sometimes, you're just right, sometimes the military needs extra capability for a surge or for a response to an emergency, and they temporarily do use some civilian assets. When that happens, the civilian asset becomes a military objective, and subject to the other criteria that limit military attacks, it is exposed. But those circumstances are rare and episodic, and the general plan is that the military uses its organic assets, not relying upon civilians to provide the extra capability. That's what's done on land, sea, and air. It's only in space that the United States encourages, recruits, tries to use civilian assets for military and intelligence community purposes as a routine matter.
Right. So again, the difference, CRAF, and is that it's episodic. So that's why this is more acceptable to you than what's happening in space.
That's right. Those other kinds of reserve fleets are used very rarely, and ordinarily not in a central campaign role. They're used to transport equipment or personnel from the United States to Europe as a staging matter, but not ordinarily into the theater of operations. In this case of outer space, it's a much more integrated, planned use. It's a declaration by the United States that our national policy is not to honor the principle of reverse distinction. Our national policy is to obliterate that distinction and use civilian space assets as much as possible for the performance of military and intelligence community functions. That's quite different from the very limited circumstances under which occasionally something similar has been done in the other domains.
Yeah. Okay, returning back to the feasibility point. So a follow-up question I have for you is, you've discussed and you write about, commercial assets being used for military purposes. But what about the opposite? Military assets being used for civilian purposes, right? To me, the issues based on how you characterize this would exist the same, right? And this is really, I think, profound in space. GPS provides immense value to citizens, and if the entire system were attacked, the consequences would be really devastating, not just for the public, but for other countries. The data from DoD's meteorological satellites is available for scientific use for civilian applications. Even our US's missile warning satellites, which on its face you would think these are the systems that are least dual use. Those detect forest fires, right? California, that information helped California last year with some of their forest fires. So to me, this is why I see this as much more in the lane of highways, right? Like these things are all dual use. We didn't, you talk about, well, in the past, the lines were super clear. To me, in the past, the lines weren't super clear. It was just military assets were providing civilian benefits, but the civilians were heavily intertwined within those military assets. Now, there are some systems that, are classified, right? That are not providing data for civilian purposes, but it's hard to think of any commercial asset that's more intertwined with civilian life than GPS. But I don't think you would say, well, DoD needs to develop a different GPS, right? Like that would seem infeasible, similar to it would seem infeasible to develop a whole new highway system. Certainly a whole new highway system is possible, but it would be an incredible amount of work, just as developing a 30+ constellation of sophisticated positioning, navigation, and timing satellites, right? So I mean, the difference between space and these other domains is that space is inherently dual use. All these things, whether it's civilians and the military both want navigation from space, they both want to use communication from space, they both want to use imagery from space, they both want to get weather data from space, right? Like all these things are inherently dual use. In the other domains, you don't have this problem as much, right? A bomber is inherently military. A ground-launched cruise missile is inherently military. There aren't civilian applications for these things, but that's just not the way it is in space. So that's kind of my view, right? It's been entangled for a really long time, and now what DoD is trying to do is okay, there's more stuff, there are more highways, and we like to use that, right? Just as when the highways we owned, when the highways were all ours, we opened them up to civilian use. Now there are commercial highways that we want to use to be able to transmit information to forces or collect imagery, right? So that's to me why I see this as much more infeasible. So, anyway, there's not a question there, but I offered a critique, so let me please respond.
Good. So 2 points. The first is just a reminder of the context. I've been talking about the law of armed conflict. It applies during an armed conflict,
right.
And this particular part of the law of armed conflict is guided by the notion of an attack. What counts as an attack? And therefore, when the military assets are being used for civilian purposes, that's not an armed conflict. That's not an attack. When the military opens up GPS for use by civilians, the law of armed conflict doesn't have any objection to that, doesn't have anything to say about that because there's no attack being made there. Similarly, when NASA integrates with the commercial sector, that's not a problem because NASA does not do armed conflict. NASA does not engage in attacks. So my article has no complaint about NASA using commercial purpose services, NASA relying upon communications or launch services or anything else from the commercial sector, because NASA is not part of the law of armed conflict. My argument focuses on using civilian assets to support making an armed attack, making a military operation. And separation is even more feasible than you might think. You may remember that in the early days of GPS, there really was a separation, a distinction between the military GPS signal and the less effective, less detailed signal that was available to commercial services. And it was a choice made by President Clinton to release the best form of GPS for free general use by civilians. I'm not saying we should go back to that, but I am saying that it is possible to do a separation. It is possible to do a distinction, and in armed attack and making an attack in the law of armed conflict, that's where the requirement comes in. The second,
but it would still be the target. I mean, I think, I mean, and even if they did, you know, if they decided to have different signals, it's still the same satellites, right? So, you know, if the reason why I think it's seemingly exactly analogous to the DoD buying commercial imagery from a satellite is that, you know, in this case, you have the same asset that is providing civilian and it is a military objective that is also a civilian asset, right? And GPS is most certainly a military objective. So from the perspective of the adversary, if I mean, GPS has got to be incredibly, I mean, you know, this point of complicating the decision-making calculus of the adversary, right? CPS has got to be the hardest one, right? Because, you know, if you were to try to attack all of GPS, you know, if you're able to do that, I mean, the civilian implications, repercussions would be immense, just as it would be if you attack the highway system or the electrical grid, right? Like, I mean, this is, but also really important for the military. And so I don't know. To me, this is, you know, whether it's a military asset that is used for civilian purposes or it's a commercial asset that's used for military purposes, in both cases, you have the same asset that's providing both. And so this reverse distinction seemingly should apply to military assets that are being used for civilian purposes. And I don't think you should split them. I just think that this shows how dual use space is versus these other domains, which is why, you know, either we need to rethink the farmer by day or fighter by night concept, or think about, you know, can we, you know, is this just fall in this infeasible category?
So that requires introduction of the second most important law of armed conflict principle. And I did not go into this earlier because I wanted to spare you and the audience more legal education. But since you asked for it, in addition to the principle of distinction, we have to take into account the principle of proportionality. And proportionality requires that in making and planning and executing an attack, the attacker has to calculate how much direct, immediate, concrete military gain do I anticipate from this attack versus how much foreseeable, unintended damage gets done to civilians.
Right.
And I have to make that calculation. And if the civilian losses would be disproportionate, if there would be too much harm inflicted upon the civilians, then I cannot do that attack or cannot do it in that way or at that time. I've got to modify the attack to come at a different angle or with a different weapon or a different time so that I can keep the military advantage from the attack, but not have as much civilian damage. And that principle of assessing proportionality is just as important as the principle of discrimination or distinction. It's, if anything, even more complicated to assess proportionality because in attacking a GPS satellite, the attacker has to calculate what's the military gain here? If I deny this service to my adversary, that's going to mean that their submarines don't know exactly where they are. That means their smart missiles are going to not be as accurate. I'm going to get some substantial military gain from that. On the other hand, there's anticipated very extensive collateral loss to the civilians because their airplanes won't know where to land and their cars won't know where they are. So there's a lot of civilian loss as well, and it may be a hard calculation for a military planning an attack to decide whether or not to shoot at the enemy's GPS signals. My guess is that a military making that calculation would conclude that it could be worth it, that it could be, the military gain could be so great that it's worth the anticipated harm to civilians. Maybe not, but that's exactly the kind of calculation that would have to be made in going after any dual use service, that you have to figure out how much gain versus how much unintended but anticipated civilian loss.
Professor Koplow, I would like to do this all day. This is really fascinating. And you and I actually kind of did this once earlier a few weeks ago at an aerospace event too. So I'm excited for part 3s and 4. However, our producers are messaging us that we are over time. So I want to close. I want to offer you any kind of closing remarks. I would encourage everyone to read this piece. Again, I think it's really stimulating. You know, again, I have a slightly different take on this, but you know, I think it's really important argument, and that we should keep discussing it and keep thinking about how, you know, perhaps at the margins, thinking about how other countries are approaching this, you know, whether there needs to be revisions. You know, my guess is that space, I think space has always been pretty dual use. And I think it's going to become increasingly so. Now that you have commercial activity that's producing some of the same things that DoD and other governments have produced. But we'll see, and you know, we'll see what happens. But I think this is an issue that could continue to evolve.
Well, let me close with just 2 quick remarks. One is to confirm that you are not alone in believing that my argument goes too far. In fact, most observers, even if they concede that I've got a nugget of a point there, would not carry the argument as far as I have. And so you're in good company. But the second point that I want to make in closing is just that I think the United States should be following the law of armed conflict completely in its military operations. The United States has pledged that it will adhere to the law of armed conflict. And if we want to be the kind of country that can criticize Saddam Hussein when he violates this principle, or can criticize Milosevic when he violates this principle, then we have to hold ourselves to the highest standards of adherence to the law of armed conflict, even if it costs more, even if it's a little bit more difficult for us to achieve the military objectives by adhering to the law of armed conflict. That's what it means to accept the rule of law. If you want to be a law-abiding country, you got to be a law-abiding country all the time.
Yeah, I'm always criticized for breaking the law. So it comports. Thanks so much, David. This was really fun. Over to you, Colleen.
Sam, Professor Koplow, thank you so much for bringing this discussion to our audience. I think it definitely needs more consideration as we continue building these dual use models for the future of space security in the US. I highly recommend that our viewers check out the full paper from the Harvard National Security Journal, Keywords Reverse Distinction. And if you want to hear more about the issues around national security space that we do here on the show, check out the collections on our main webpage at csps.aerospace.org/space policy show. James Liggins is our technical director. Jordan Bingham is our program coordinator. And just a reminder that all of our shows are also available on your favorite podcast platform. So subscribe to the show and then you'll get notifications on new episodes. All right, see you next time.